Okay. Good morning. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, good. Yeah. So this morning we are continuing our series, The Struggle is Real, being fully human in a broken world. And for my sermon, I've chosen a character from the Bible that I've sat with for about 5 years that I find really fascinating, and it's Joseph, an Old Testament hero. Keep coming back to him and looking at his life, especially because I'm a counselor working with people who go through a lot of suffering. And one of the questions I'm asking myself is, how can you go through horrendous circumstances, mature in those circumstances? And with Joseph, we see that he became really influential in the public sphere as well, blessing other people with his leadership in a way that went far beyond his own world. So I'm just curious, how did that come about? So resilience is a big kind of buzzword in our world now, or resiliency, I think, as it's called in the States, isn't it? So this idea of how do people get resilient? And there's a lot of theories out there. And I would like to look a little bit, I'd like to look at Genesis 50 with you today to have a look at what does this part of Scripture tell us about resilience? How did Joseph become the person that he was? And then later in life, how did he continue being a resilient person? Before we dive into our passage in Genesis 50, let's prepare the backdrop a little bit. Speaking of a broken world, Joseph is born into a family with plenty of brokenness. I'm a systemic counselor, so for me, I'm really interested in how do family systems work, what's happening. We're individuals. I believe in the West we have a very, very individualistic view of seeing people, but actually we are part of a bigger family system. So when I work with a client, one of the first things I'm interested in is, who are you people? Who are you connected to? What is your story? So Joseph is being born into a family. He's one of 12 sons, initially one of 11. His father has 2 wives, and he also has children with 2 servants. And it's a really complicated situation. Joseph is his father's favorite son, the golden child, and there is quite a rift between him and his brothers because of that. And from my counseling perspective, I'm thinking, really, this is not so much about Joseph, it's about the dad. It's about a father who gives all his love to that one son. And really the jealousy isn't so much about Joseph, it's about the father who doesn't give the love and attention to his other sons. Jacob turns towards Joseph. He gives him privileges when really his other sons also need his love and his attention. So Joseph is his dad's favorite, and he also aspires to be a great leader. He starts dreaming dreams in which his family bow down to him, and he also shares those dreams with his brothers in a way that probably is fairly problematic. He also talks badly about his brothers. I went back to the story at the beginning. He gives a bad report to his dad about what his brothers are doing. And eventually his brothers have had enough of him. They first decide to kill him, but then they change plans and they sell him to a caravan of Midianites that are traveling through their land on their way to Egypt, selling him as a slave and telling the father that Joseph has died and has been killed by wild beasts. Meanwhile, Joseph is sold by a slave trader to an employee of the Egyptian king, Pharaoh. His master Potiphar soon realizes Joseph has a knack for business and for administration, and he leaves everything in Joseph's care. It must have been quite a big shock. I tried to imagine you're being sold as a slave first. There's a huge culture shock. The new language, I don't think he spoke Egyptian, I can't imagine. And then the reality of probably never seeing your father again. I'm sure he loved his father just as much as father loved him. So things were really dire for him. But then things take a slight upward turn. God blesses the work of Joseph's hands, and his master's estate thrives. But then he gets wrongly accused of rape, or attempted rape. And as if things weren't bad enough for him now, Joseph ends up in prison. And as a slave, he has no rights anyway. There's no way of defending himself. and he doesn't know is he ever going to leave prison again. And something similar happens here in prison, in the dungeon, something similar to what happened in his master's, in Potiphar's house. What happens? Joseph finds favor with the guards, and he runs the prison. Yeah, so the guards leave everything in his care. So he must have had really good people skills, but also, again, the administrative skills come out here. And he looks after other prisoners, and in the midst of really tough situations, he thrives in a really interesting way. So we see a thread here. God has promised leadership to him. Well, he is leading, not in the way that he probably wanted to lead, but he was leading in Potiphar's house. Now he's leading in prison. And Joseph interprets the dream of two influential prisoners who both work for the Egyptian king, for the Pharaoh. One of them is released, one of them gets killed. And Joseph is hoping, now is the moment I'm going to get out of prison. It doesn't happen. He waits for another 2 years in the dungeon to be set free. I wonder what that felt for him. Did he feel, oh God, and people have deserted me? Was he still hoping that his dream of great leadership would come true? But then Pharaoh has a dream, and that changes the whole story. The man who was released, whose dream got interpreted by Joseph, remembers Joseph and his ability. And then what follows is a whirlwind of events. Joseph predicts a famine that will threaten Egypt. He becomes vice-regent. Then he draws up a plan to save Egypt. And then in the midst of the famine, he meets his brothers again who come to Egypt for food, not knowing who he is. And there's a great showdown in the story. Joseph reveals himself. He shows mercy to his brothers, and he brings his whole family to Egypt, including his dad later on, and they all settle in the land of Egypt. Let's keep this backdrop in mind as we read the story. Joseph's life is an absolute roller coaster, at least until the age of 30. So he was 17 when the story with his first dreams happened. And he was 30, we know that from the book of Genesis, when he became vice-regent. So 13 years. Is that right? Yeah. 13 years of a journey, and it was an absolute roller coaster. Joy. I would love you to read this. And as we read it, let's have a look out for where do we see him being resilient in really difficult circumstances, and in good circumstances later on when he's in a good position.
So, Genesis.
Just going to turn this on.
Yeah, I don't know if it's you. Maybe it's you. Genesis 50, verses 15 to 26. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these instructions before. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now, please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place." So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt.
So when I was sitting with this text over the last few weeks, I was imagining a conversation with with the older Joseph in the last years of his life. And I imagine asking him, so Joseph, what is your secret? What is your secret sauce? Why are you so resilient? Where does it come from? What are the ingredients of your resilience? Your ability to move through really difficult circumstances and to grow stronger in the midst of them, not to break. And the longer I sat in this text and read Joseph's story, and we spent some family, we have a time of praying and reading the Bible in the evenings together as a family, and I just asked my family to join in and read that story with me. It's a long story. It's got lots of twists and turns. And the longer we looked at the twists and turns and Joseph's life together, the more a structure emerged in our reading. I thought Joseph is teaching a masterclass in resilience here. And today in the world of influencers and online influencers, masterclasses are a great way of distilling your wisdom into a talk that will then be a teaser for people to see, do they want to learn more from you? So in this masterclass, Joseph teaches us 3 secrets of resilience, and I'd like to share them with you. Firstly, be real about what you feel. This is about our inward journey. Secondly, look at life through the God lens. This is about our relationship with God, so upward journey, or downward from God's perspective. Thirdly, hope beyond today. This is about moving forward in our lives. Let's start with the first one. Be real about what you feel. There's a very short sentence in this passage, in the second part of verse 17, one that we can easily miss, that tells us a lot about Joseph's inner world. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. Let's slow it down here and think, what is happening here? Joseph is receiving a message from his brothers, and he's looking right through their schemes. I think what's happening here is, in their attempt to protect themselves, they push the dad, who's now passed away, forward to make sure that now Joseph is not going to take revenge on them. Joseph knows that. He's not naive. And he knows they're making up a story here. The father's instructions aren't real. And after all the love and the kindness and the grace and the mercy that he's shown to them, they still don't trust him. And after years of living in Egypt under his protection, they still don't believe that their powerful brother really means it. Instead of seeking connection and honestly sharing about their fear, what they do is they use tricks to stay on Joseph's good side. They have no connection with what's going on inwardly. But Joseph is behaving so differently, and I'm really excited about seeing that. First, what is striking is he cries, he weeps. He acknowledges that there is something happening inside that has to do with loss, because that is what grief is about. It's about loss. I've lost something here. I like saying to my counseling clients, what is a feeling? A feeling is a gift from our operating system that gives us vital information about what is happening, how we interpret what is happening, and what we need because of what is happening. So if we can catch the information, then we can get our need met. Yeah? The information that Joseph was getting was sadness. There was loss. And I think this loss probably had to do with a loss of connection with his brothers. He thought there was connection with them, when really there was no connection. They were pretending to be close to him out of fear. And Joseph connects with that sadness. When we're sad, our operating system is telling us, I've lost something. And that can be the loss of a person that was dear to us. But in my life, often sadness is about a loss of dreams, for example. Something I was hoping, I was expecting to happen, and it hasn't happened. That can also create sadness. Sometimes it's something small, sometimes it's something big. But if we don't catch the information, we have a real problem. If we don't know we've lost something, we cannot tend to that need. Well, Joseph knows about his loss. He weeps. And it's not the first time that he weeps. We know from the great reveal in chapter 45, where Joseph weeps so loudly that the whole household of Pharaoh hears him crying. He doesn't weep in front of his brothers because he doesn't want to give away yet what's happening, but he's breaking down behind the scenes. And I'm also reminded of Jesus, the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. Jesus was very much in touch with his emotions. He cried, and not just once, and he also showed those tears. He cried over people, he cried over Lazarus, he cried over Jerusalem. So if we think sadness and grief and tears are something that is only for people who have broken lives or who don't have it together, actually, I think crying sometimes really helps to get things together again. Yeah, there's some studies on hormones that crying often helps to release stress and to cry out what is stuck inside of us. Joseph is a guy who feels his emotions very strongly. And he uses his information, the sadness, to reconnect with his brothers. He's proactive. While they're trying to scheme their schemes, he has a conversation with them. He says, "You are safe." But he doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't say, this was an accident that I ended up here in Egypt. No, it wasn't an accident. They meant to harm him. And he says that to them very clearly. He says, you meant it for bad, but then God worked it out for good. Joseph knows it was not an accident. And he's real about his feelings, his sadness, but also his compassion and his longing for connection with his brothers. So what is the link with resilience here, between feelings and resilience? The answer is Joseph weeps, he expresses what is happening on the inside to his brothers, and he's not on autopilot, but he very intentionally connects with them again. He's also connected with his own desires, his needs to live at peace with his family. And he expresses it in a heartfelt and compassionate way. We know from neuroscience that people who are emotionally intelligent, so who know their inner worlds, are better prepared for difficult circumstances. So we might think if we push away a feeling, we can get through life better. Actually, it's the opposite. If we can read our operating system well, we can react much better to what we need. So emotional intelligence protects mental health, and it's also really good for our close relationships. When feelings can move through us, when we notice what's happening inside of us, the feeling doesn't get stuck, but it can move through us and we can do something about it. And then it can leave again because it's done its job, which is giving us information about what's happening. So if we want to be resilient, firstly, let's be real about what we feel. Learning to be fully human in a broken world is a great thing. Feelings are a gift to us, and they are valuable information. And yet, if this first point was all about, was all that I'm bringing today, I think we would miss out on a lot of things. There's a lot more to Joseph's stories. There's a lot more treasure in this passage that goes far beyond being human. And I want to invite us to go deeper and look at those things as well. So my second point today is see life through the God lens. And what does that mean? Joseph is real when he talks about his brother's intention. They wanted to harm him. They meant bad things for him. But it doesn't stop there. You intended to harm me, he says, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So Joseph tells his family story from a perspective that holds both. It holds the real, the painful, and it holds the rich and the blessing in his life. He's both factual and he talks about the purpose. The overall story of his life is, my God is a good God who loves me and who has good plans for my life and who's going to bring to fruition what he has promised to me. In chapter 45, he spells it out so clearly, and I was really touched, kind of being reminded of, in that great reveal to his brothers, he says, do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. And I'm just, sent me ahead of you. What interpretation is that after he's been sold as a slave? He completely reframed his story. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to say that. Yeah? And reframing is a great method that we use in counseling, this idea of circumstances are awful. How might you look at your life in a different way? How might you tell a different story about your life that doesn't sugarcoat things, but at the same time brings healing rather than desolation? And a few verses later he says, so then it was not you who sent me here, but God. That's his perspective. Looking back on his life, Joseph is probably in his 50s now. His father has passed away. 20 years have passed since the great reveal. And he still believes in God's goodness for his family. Joseph knows about the brokenness in his family system. He doesn't deny it, and yet he could only tell the story of a broken family, a story of his brothers as the villains and him as the victim, and how God saved him, and that was it. But instead, he tells a story of a God who's good to his whole family, a God who sees the bigger picture, a God who allows suffering and yet redeems in the midst of suffering. And I don't know about you, but I'm really touched by his attitude that there was devastation, and I'm sure it was so devastating being sold into slavery. I don't think he thought, I think he felt deeply. He was a deeply emotional man, so he will have felt deeply the betrayal by his brothers. I don't think he pretended everything was fine. And I'm sure there was a lot of maturing happening from the 17-year-old to the 30-year-old who then came to power. But he tells a story of a good God and a story of a God who loves him and his family. Where there was devastation only at first, now is also mission. Being sent, that's what mission means. Being sent. God sent him to prepare the way for his family so they didn't have to starve. Who would have thought that this story, we know now because we look back, but who would have thought that the story would turn out like that? Joseph couldn't have planned this in any way. And when Joseph says, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives, he continues to tell a story of a good God. Now, he's close to dying now, and he died at 110, so another 60 years passed since the time probably when his dad died. And now he's not just telling the story of what happened in the past, but he's also looking into the future. He's looking for God's goodness in the coming generations, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the third point. God's story with Joseph and his family is the story of Israel that is not finished in the midst of challenges. And I think we all agree that being sold into slavery by your family, taken to a foreign country against your will, being wrongly accused of rape, imprisonment, are all serious challenges. But in the midst of these, Joseph's life is centered around his God. He sees life through the God lens. And we see, when we look at Joseph's story in the earlier chapters, we already see some glimpses of that maturity. The first one I found was when Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. And he said no. And what he says to her is, my master has withheld nothing from me except you because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? So yes, it's about her, but for him it's more about God. That's how he sees God is at the center of his life. He's looking through the God lens at life. God's view of life is his compass, his true north. And later when he stands in front of Pharaoh and Pharaoh says, I've heard you can interpret dreams. Joseph says, I cannot do it. And we had a little laugh as a family when we read that. We imagined Joseph in front of this powerful man. It's like, you can give me the answer. And he says, no, I can't. But then he says, but God will give Pharaoh the answer that he desires. So again, he looks at life through the God lens. I can't do it, but God will do it. Joseph acknowledges, I have a gift, but the gift is from God. I'm the vessel here. And I'm working with God, but he's really behind the whole thing. The glory is all his, and the glory continues to be God's, even later on. as Joseph gets older. What has shaped him in secret in the early years of his life now is being lived out on a grand scale in public, on a national level. And if we look at Joseph's story through the God lens, we can see plenty of pointers to someone else who was the special son of his father, was a Hebrew living in Egypt, even only for a little while, sold for silver by his own people, and paved the way for his nation and for other nations. The story of Joseph, from a messianic perspective, is a foreshadow of the story of Jesus. And I found an article by someone online who found 60 similarities. I thought some of them were a bit far-fetched, but there's quite a lot of structures that we can see here, quite a lot of parallels between those two lives. And while Joseph was a faithful man, he was man only, but Jesus was human and he was God, fully human and fully God. And guys, this is something I can still not wrap my head around, how that is possible. But both of these were united in him, the mystery of Jesus being fully human and being fully God. It's hard to comprehend for my human brain. Jesus' death on the cross and resurrection also paved the way for his own people, for the people of Israel, and then later for the Gentiles, for us. He also brought salvation in a different way, by freeing from sin and welcoming us into God's family. He says, come here and settle here with me, like Joseph did with his own family. Come here, be under my protection. He didn't force his family to do that, but he said, you're going to have a good life here. I forgive you. I know what you've done, but you know what? I forgive you. And he created a space for them to live close to him. Isn't that a lot like what Jesus has done? Jesus welcomes us. He says, I see you. You're my beloved son, my beloved daughter. And I think the parallels between those two characters are so striking because ultimately the story of the Bible, the story of the world, I believe, is ultimately a story about Jesus and about his relationship with his Father and how he came to earth to save us. And if we can see Jesus in Joseph, we can't unsee it. There's so many parallels there. So coming back to our topic of resilience now, how is Joseph being resilient by looking at life through the God lens? Let's take a moment to think about that. If we live from the anchor point of we have a God who intends to bless us and lead us in the midst of a broken world, we will live a full, not necessarily an easy life, but a rich life and a life that is deeply rooted in God. And there will be storms, and we will feel lost sometimes, and we will need to connect with our feelings, and we will experience devastation and difficulty. And if we ignore that, that's bad counsel to do that. Yeah. And I think a lot of the Psalms, I love the Psalms. I preached on Psalm 42 last year, and this idea of, David talks about how the waves wash over him and he feels like he's going to drown. He's not pretending that things are okay. So that feeling part is really important. But if we forget the God lens part, we get swept away by our feelings, and we get the information, but there's no hope, and we need hope to get back on our feet and to mature. And that's really what I'd like to go into for our last point is hope beyond today. So I'm looking at Joseph's story. He's 110 now. He's lived a full and rich life. He's reached the mountaintop in the political sphere and professionally. And he sees Manasseh's the third generation after his son Manasseh. So 4 generations. He's a dad, a granddad, a great-granddad, and a great-great-granddad. Can you imagine that? They were all placed on his knee. So he saw into the future quite far ahead at 110. But that was not enough for him. He was not complacent. What he wanted to see the deliverance of God's people. At that point, they were not enslaved yet. But what he wanted to see was the promise of God being fulfilled. And the promise was, you're going to have your own land. He gave that promise to Abraham, his great-grandfather, then again to Isaac, his grandfather, and to his dad Jacob. It hadn't happened. And Joseph was longing for that to happen. He wanted to see God's promise being fulfilled. He could have been complacent. He had a good life, at least at the end of his life. But at the forefront was what's going to happen next. What's going to happen to what's going to happen to our tribes? What's going to happen to our family? So he makes his family promise to him that they have to swear an oath. So it says, let me see where that is in the passage. I'm about to die, he says, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land and to the land he promised, an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So again, we see God is very much at the center of his thinking, not just here and now, but beyond his own lifespan. God will surely come to your aid. He says that twice. I think that was really striking. In such a short space of time, we can't overlook it. And it's so important that there is hope here, hope for his own life, but then also hope for his family, hope in a faithful God who keeps his promises. He banks on God's promises for the promised land. He believes that his family are going to have their own territory, their own home. And his hope is so concrete, and I was really struck by that basically he said, dig up my bones when it comes to it and take them with you. And it's going to take 400 years, I think, in the story until that happens. So, it's not around the corner. So again, we see the outworking of an attitude that Joseph has practiced for a long time, to be expectant that God will accomplish what he has announced. And I'm saying that to myself as well at the moment, where I'm at with my story. God's made a few promises to us as a family, and also to Roman and me in our coaching business. And I'm starting to see some shoots, but I'm not seeing yet what God has promised. And I'm expectant. But what I've learned from this story is I want to see the horizon. I want to see the hope, because when there's hope in the room, we can get through some pretty tough things. And I'm just thinking of our counseling practice. Hope, is the name of the practice that we run here at CCE. And when there is hope in the room, everything is possible. If we lose hope, we lose everything. But if we have hope, we can move towards it. And although Joseph himself will not see that part of the story, because he will have died by then, he fully hopes that his God is going to remember his people and fulfill his promises. So, and then we know from the book of Exodus, it really happened under really horrendous circumstances. Pharaoh didn't let them go, and it took a long time. But in the end, they got to the promised land. God rescues his people from slavery in a miraculous way and calls them his own. Hope and resilience, how do those two go together? They form a positive cycle. When we hope, we become more resilient, and when we are resilient, we hope more. So we know that from people who have lived under the most horrendous circumstances, and I've mentioned Viktor Frankl's example here. Viktor Frankl was a psychologist of Jewish origin, and he was placed in a concentration camp by the National Socialists, the Nazi Party. And he had in his book, Trotzdem Ja zum Leben sagen, I think it's Man's Search for Meaning in English, is that right? So what he talks about is, in German, it's saying yes to life nevertheless. I like that, yeah? He says what kept him alive was not his inner strength. What kept him alive was a vision he had. And he had a very clear vision, and I've spoken about this before a while ago. He had a vision that he would give a talk, that he would give a speech of his experience from the point of somebody who had survived the camp in a particular place at the University of Vienna in the Golden Assembly Room. And he kept repeating that. He kept rehearsing that. How would it feel to be there? How will it feel to look people in the eye and say, I've survived these atrocities? And he really ended up giving that speech. And he said one of the biggest things, when in the midst of what was going horrendously, and he knew he could lose his life at any point, those visions that he held on to, the hope, that was what made him get up in the morning and continue his life. And I think Joseph displays a similar quality here in our passage. And he's practiced that over a long time. He must have practiced that when he was in prison, when he was a slave, when he was waiting for another 2 years. So it all starts with his vision of fulfilling God's plan for his life. God said, "You will be a great leader." And Joseph was not very mature at that point, and the way he communicates it to his brothers is debatable. But I think the vision, that was from God. God said, "You will be a great leader." And there was hope in him, and over time maturity then also joined the hope. As a 17-year-old, he didn't have that maturity yet. But then over time he grew stronger, and I think what I love about Joseph is he kept that tender heart. He wasn't just a strong leader, but he kept being really, he kept that tender heart for God and for people in the midst of trials with his family. And I strongly believe that it was hope that helped him to be faithful and that helped him to be proactive in his life. Joseph had an attitude of someone who believed God will come through for me. It's going to happen. I don't know how it's going to happen, and this is where I'm at the moment. I don't know how God wants to continue to build our relationship coaching practice, but he's promised to do that, so it's going to happen. And I wonder what God has promised to you. Were you thinking, I'm not sure how? He said that to me, but it's not happening. Joseph's hope is not a vague hope, it's a very concrete hope that God will deliver his people. What does hope have to do with resilience? We've spoken about it, everything. Hope is closely tied to purpose and closely tied to meaning. We know that people who believe that they will get better, sick people who believe they're going to get better with, especially with cancer patients. I think it was a research on breast cancer patients. People who have hope and who have love in their lives tend to recover much better and have much better chances of continuing to live. And I've spoken about the name Hope for our counseling service. I think for us that is central. We want to see people connect with hope. So if Joseph was here today to give the masterclass in his own words, I think he would encourage us to hope beyond today and even beyond tomorrow. Not just in anyone, but in the God who has proven to be faithful in the midst of dire circumstances. We're coming to the end of our time together now. If we want to be resilient, just as a little summary, if we want to be resilient, we will not build our lives on the circumstances that change and shift all the time, but will become people who are honest with their own feelings at good times and at bad times. Sometimes it's easier to be honest with ourselves at the bad times, but actually checking in and saying, this is great, and connecting with the joy that we have and that we experience that God gives us. We're going to look at life through the God perspective, the God lens, and we're going to be anchored in the hope that stretches beyond today. And we're going to have a few minutes now, and there's 3 questions I have prepared for us to think about, and we're going to have some music in the background. Where am I currently struggling to be real about what I feel? This is about our inward journey. Or you could think about, in what area of my life do I need to see things again through the God lens? This is about our relationship with God, our upward journey. And thirdly, what would it look like for me to hold on to hope beyond today? This is about our forward journey into the next season of our lives. So God bless you as you have a little think about what that means for you in this situation right now.